Good morning everyone, and welcome to another out and about video. And today's video brings us here to the magnificent Accrington cemetery, and we're going to uncover and retell the story, the true story of a barbaric murder that occurred in Accrington back on the 9th of June 1896. Now today's story, even though previous videos we always try to make it about the victims, this video will still be like that, but it is kind of different because there's two individuals involved. One is obviously the victim, one is obviously the murderer. And I say that with a bit of a pause because we're going to get into the ins and outs of what occurred and how somebody who was accused of murder may not have been the murderer. It'll all make sense towards the end. So, like I say, even though we try to make all these videos about the victims, just so they're never forgotten, you know, the names were never forgotten in the fog of the past, if you will. This video we are going to concentrate as well on the murderer. Now, the murderer was a young 15-year-old apprentice by the name of Christopher Hindle, and the story we are about to tell you took place, like I said, on the 9th of June 1896, further on back in Accrington, which isn't too far from where we are now in that direction, and all took place at number 3 Warner Street.
Just after 10 AM on the morning of Tuesday 9th of June 1896, a young boy burst into the workshop of John Coates and his son Thomas, which was situated along the cobbled road of Bridge Street, Accrington, and just behind the now forgotten Brown Cow Public Inn. In a frenzied state of mind, the boy shouted, "Oh, Mrs. Coates is murdered!" Not sure what was happening, Mr. Coates replied back, "Nothing of the sort." However, the young boy raised one of his arms, and to the horror of Mr. Coates, what looked like fresh splatters of blood could be seen.
Now, when they actually got back to number 3 Warner Street, both John and his son Thomas ran up the stairs to the bedroom where the attack and the murder took place on Mrs. Coates. Now, Sarah Coates, or Mrs. Coates, she was still alive when they got there, but barely. And even though they tried to help her, you know, and try to get her to speak and to say something, all she kept saying was, "Turn me over on my side." The events obviously quickly transpired. You know, police were informed, and I think Christopher Hindle himself ran along, I think it was Oak Street, down onto Abbey Street and the other nearby streets, and he found several police officers, one being PC Andrews, and he shouted as he ran past him that there's been a murder on Warner Street. So PC Andrews, he made his way up to number 3, and when he got there was a lot more people around, and the place was all frantic, it was hectic, people crying, screaming, grown men not knowing really what to do. Now, amongst all this commotion, nobody quite could understand how and why this tragedy would have happened, because Sarah Coates, she was 61 years old. From all accounts, her and her husband and her son Thomas were well liked in the community. You know, they never done anybody any harm. So, you know, this was a quite bizarre and unique murder. Now, as you can imagine, obviously when something as shocking as a murder occurs, no matter what era or where it occurs, it's going to be frightening for everybody concerned. Not obviously just the family, but we're talking obviously local residents, neighbours, family, friends. But with this murder, it did seem to be quite bizarre in nature. The reason being, when Christopher Hindle was being interviewed by the police, he told of how he'd heard a noise in the upper bedroom, in the back bedroom, and when he went up to investigate, he'd seen a man leaning over Sarah. Sarah was on the floor and it looked like she'd already been attacked and, you know, badly beaten. But it was the description he gave which the police instantly, obviously they worked on. Inspector Sinclair, I think it was, he sent a bulletin to all police stations in the borough, neighbourhood towns, and you know, things like that, because obviously they wanted to capture this person as quick as they could. So he sent a bulletin out and he told all police officers to be on guard and obviously to check the exits into and out of Accrington. Also, he sent police officers undercover, you know, in plain clothes, just to try to spot this guy. So now you'd be asking, well, how did they know who they were looking for?
According to a description of the man made by Hindle, he had appeared to be 28 or 30 years of age and around 5 feet 8 inches in height. He had a dark complexion, black moustache, and was very smart in general appearance, with a low fashionably cut waistcoat and blue tie.
So we know Sarah Coates was interred somewhere here in Accrington Cemetery. I think it was the 12th of June when her body was brought to this place, her final resting place. From all accounts, people were paying their respects by closing the window blinds. The streets along Burnley Road, all the way across, it was packed to the rafters. Even the actual cemetery itself was packed with people who wanted to pay the final respects. But where she's interred, we do not have a clue. From the newspaper articles, like I said, we know she's buried here, and I'll put a description over the screen now, but we can't find anywhere online. We've checked everywhere. We've tried Ancestry, we've tried Find a Grave or Find My Grave, Billion Graves, we've tried Deceased Online, we've tried everywhere, and we can't find poor Sarah's final resting place, and especially the grave number. Because, and I say it all the time, if you look down at the grave, like this one for example, they all have their own identification numbers. We can't find anything relating to Sarah Coates. It's quite frustrating because we do know she's here somewhere, and as you can see, I don't know if the GoPro's picking up, there's that many headstones and gravestones here. It's going to take a mammoth effort to find her. I mean, if we do come across it, it is going to be just pure luck, it really is. So I'm not holding out much hope that we are going to find her today. We will keep checking, and in doing so we'll obviously carry on with the story of what happened back on the 9th of June 1896. So with the description of the so-called perpetrator of the crime now circulating all throughout the boroughs, Inspector Sinclair, he sent PC Andrews along with Christopher Hindle to the police, to the train station, I should say, over in Accrington, in the hope that obviously Christopher could spot this guy out, because he told Sinclair that if he'd seen him again, he would be able to identify him. That came to nothing. So Hindle and Andrews made their way back to number 3 Warner Street, and whilst they were there, Sinclair said, well, go down to the police station, obviously we need to ask you further questions. So PC Andrews escorted Hindle to the police station. It was at the police station when 2 doctors did some checks on Christopher Hindle, and especially his arm. Now, even though he had 18 or so superficial wounds to his right arm, with only 2 which you probably could say were quite deep, the rest of them, as well as the 2 obviously, both doctors came to the conclusion that these wounds could quite have easily been self-inflicted. And now this will become an important piece of information that the prosecution would later use in court. Inspector Sinclair himself, he stayed at number 3 Warner Street to do some checks obviously throughout the property, and he went to the back door where the guy who Hindle said was attacking Sarah left by. Now Sinclair said that he couldn't find any evidence of any kind. There were no blood splatters, there was just nothing to indicate that the perpetrator of the crime had left by the upper back bedroom, if you will, and climbed over a wall. So things weren't starting to fall into place, to be honest, and even though the police had took Christopher Hindle's statement seriously, something wasn't quite right. And it all came out later, it would transpire that Hindle himself was kind of changing his statements with whomever he spoke to. So for instance, he told one police constable, I think it was Andrews, that he chased the man down back Warner Street and then down Oak Street, whereas on another statement he actually said he chased the guy up to the top end of Abbey Street, but the guy was too quick and he disappeared towards the Wesleyan Chapel. And there was another statement where apparently he said he made his way down to Church Street. But the thing is now, all these conflicting statements would eventually go against Christopher Hindle when obviously all this was brought up in court later on. So it was on Wednesday, 10th of June, when the inquest into Sarah Coates' death would commence in Accrington. And the actual time it took for all the evidence and everything else to be discussed was around 7 hours. Now, I think there were up to 16 people that were interviewed who gave statements as to what happened on that morning. People who were on the streets, people who were at work, people who knew Christopher Hindle, as well as the Coates family. They all came out. But it was like I said, it was the evidence that Sinclair would put forward, you know, the conflicting statements that Hindle had made, the fact that there was no blood trails towards the back entrance of Warner Street. All these would basically, it would make Christopher Hindle complicit in the murder of Sarah Coates. Now, as for Sarah Coates herself, when one of the police officers made his way to the scene, she passed away 8 minutes later. Now, the police officer in question, he actually asked her who had attacked her, who had done this horrible deed to her, and she managed to get one word out, and that word was nobody. Now, the sad thing about this entire story that we have to remember is, and this is what I said right at the beginning of the video, even though this video and all videos are about the victims, in this case, in this story, we do have to remember that we are talking about a 15-year-old boy, who, well, he was 15 at the time in 1896. He came from a poor family, but he was trying to make his way in life as an apprentice. He was a cabinet maker who worked for John Coates, Mr. Coates. As for the Coateses, I'm not sure if they were wealthy, but they weren't short of a few bob, you know. I mean, they had their own business, and this is what I'm saying. John Coates and his son Thomas, they had like a workshop on Bridge Street. They also had the back bedrooms, the back rooms, where they lived on number 3 Warner Street. So yeah, I mean, they weren't broke, they weren't poor, but they were a hard-working family who never harmed and never had a bad word, I don't think, to say about anybody. And like I said, Christopher Hindle, his background came from a poor family. His father Thomas and his mother Margaret. I think he had 2 brothers and 1 sister. But we do have to remember that we're dealing with a 15-year-old boy. So all the statements that he made to the police at the time could have been one out of fear, it could have been one out of shock, it could have been one out of it could have been naive, basically, you know, getting the place names, the street names muddled up. Because they are close within each other. You've got, I think it's Warner Street, Oak Street, and then you've got Abbey Street running up the side. So all these streets are very close together. So when he was telling the police officers that he'd run down this street and that street and the other street, it could well have easily got them muddled up. Okay, perhaps I'm being naive in thinking this, but I am trying to put myself in the shoes of a 15-year-old boy who is now basically being complicit in the murder of a 61-year-old lady. So as you can see, and just like in a lot of other videos, these are the type of situations which kind of frustrate me and Vicky, because we come out, we do the research, we do find the final resting places of all the people in the stories, but as you can see, there's a lot of empty space. Well, when I say empty space, obviously we do know there's people below our feet, but look at all the headstones that are missing. It does make it a lot more harder than what it should be to locate, you know, the people in these stories. But like I said, we do know not young Sarah, but we do know poor Sarah, I should say. She is somewhere in this cemetery, but it just goes on, and it's quite a big cemetery at that.
On Wednesday, July the 8th, 1896, the trial of Christopher Hindle on the charge of murdering Sarah Coates will begin at the Lancaster Assizes, with Mr Justice Cave presiding over the case. The trial would only last one day, with Mr C.P. McKeon and Mr Ambrose Jones prosecuting, and it was Mr McKeon who would open proceedings with a long and thoroughly detailed explanation of what had taken place back on the 9th of June. The jury retired just after 5 p.m, but would only be gone for around 12 minutes. On their returning to court, a verdict of guilty, but added a strong recommendation of mercy on Hindle. When asked why sentence of death should not be passed upon him, Hindle made no reply, so it left Mr Justice Cave with nothing else but to say, except for passing down the sentence of death in the usual form.
So after the trial at Lancaster Assizes, and we know Christopher Hindle obviously was found guilty of the murder of Sarah Coates, petitions started pretty much instantly, and I think it was his solicitor, Mr Withers, who instigated the petition straight away, and he would garner the interest of hundreds of locals, of people from Accrington, as well as influential businessmen. He also managed to get the names of the religious ministers at the time, because everybody thought a 15-year-old should not be sentenced to hang for something he may not have done. And this is the thing, a lot of people said at the time that what he was saying about this man in the blue suit, the police should have took more seriously. The police themselves, like I said, because they used the fact that there was no blood in the back streets, his statements kind of changed sporadically. They used that against him. There was nothing else. There was no other proof that Christopher Hindle was the actual murderer. And so this is why people who signed the petition, they were quietly confident that even though he may not hang, he would still have to do, you know, penal servitude. They thought, you know, his chances of dodging the hangman's noose, if you will, were extremely high.
A collection was also made to help cover the costs of the trial for the parents of Hindle, who were very, very poor. With youth on his side, many thought this would be enough to save him. They would be right, and on Wednesday, 15th of July, a telegram at Accrington from Sir Joseph Leese, MP, announced the decision of the Home Secretary to respite the death sentence handed down to Hindle.
Now, interesting, when his appeal came through and the Home Secretary commuted the death sentence on Christopher Hindle, he'd already written a letter to his parents back home, and in the letter there was a lot of sentences and a lot of words, if you will, which kind of, they seemed sincere, you know, they seemed honest. He kept saying he was an innocent man and he hoped that God will eventually help him, and that the person who actually committed the murder on Sarah Coates would eventually either come forward or it would be found, it would be captured. There's a lot in the letter which kind of convinces me that he may well have been, you know, telling the truth all along, and he never deviated away from his story about the man in the blue suit. It was always I am innocent, that man did it. That's what he told everybody. Now, the thing is, with actual penal servitude, we know that obviously Hindle, he was incarcerated at Lancaster prison for a short while, then he went down to Manchester prison, and then he was relocated or moved to a prison over in Dorset. He would only serve 11 years in prison for the crime before he was released. I think it was 1907. Now, upon his release, he relocated to Liverpool, and then a couple of years later, from Liverpool, he made his way over to Quebec in Canada, and I think it was the Atlantic shipliner, the Megantic, which was part of the White Star Dominion line. I think it was a sister or the same company as the Titanic, but he relocated to Quebec in Canada. Now, we don't really know what happened after that. We don't know why he came back, but round about, I think it was 1915 possibly, I think I put the year down below, but he did end up back in England, and he ended up in Coventry, where he married a lady by the name of Louisa Taylor. Now, together, both Christopher and Louisa would have 2 children. One was called Thomas and the other the name Jack. And in 1915 or 1916, he relocated up back into the northwest of England and to number 534 Burnley Road, and that's in Waterfoot, so really not too far away from here in Accrington. As for his father, his father passed away, I think it was around about 1910 or 1912, and his mother not too long later, so they moved into his parents' house in Burnley Road.
Now, it was during Hindle's incarceration in Manchester prison that something intriguing came to light, and that was an alleged confession from a man who had admitted to killing Sarah Coates. On the 28th of July 1896, the mangled remains of a body were discovered on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway line near Bent Bridge in Leyland. Upon investigation, several items of interest came to light that, in some respects, maybe should have been taken more seriously. Firstly, the body of the man was that of John William Murray. Secondly, he was aged between 28 and 30 years old and of medium build and with a moustache. But perhaps more tellingly, he was wearing a blue suit. And if we are to add more fuel to this fire, he was a hairdresser and assistant to a Mr. Liptrot on Abbey Street, Accrington, extremely close to where the events of June the 9th had taken place.
So, we can say that Christopher himself, he did have a long and fruitful life, if you will. He had 2 children, he married, he had jobs, several jobs. One was working for an engineering pattern maker in Rosendale. His wife was a dressmaker. So he went on to live what I would class as a normal, healthy life. And this is what I mean about the story having 2 sides to it. You've got the life of Sarah Coates being sadly taken from her, and we should never ever forget that. But then we also had the life of Christopher Hindle, who, like I said, he served his time. He served 11 years imprisonment, not a full life internment, if you will. Some people, and it could be family members of the Coates family, they might think I'm being a bit naive. They might think I'm basically looking at things that aren't there. But I just think that everything is said about the blue-suited man, and how lax the police were in not investigating the mangled body that was found on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway that morning. Everything tied up, the blue suit, the description, the moustache, the build, the age. We know John Williams Murray, he lived on Abbey Street, which was literally on the corner of Warner Street, within a few minutes walk. So Christopher and John will most likely have seen each other at some point. They may well have known each other on a friendly term, a friendly basis. They might have spoke to each other regular, but the police didn't see any connection with this guy committing suicide over in Leyland to the description that Christopher Hindle made. Why? We just can't work that one out. Did the police, did they not do the job properly? Did they feel that they've got the culprit, they've got the guy, they've caught the murderer of Sarah Coates, they didn't need to reopen the case? But it seems to me that there was more to the John Williams Murray story than meets the eye. Now, what does kind of puzzle me, and it bothers me to some extent, is 2 years after Sarah Coates was murdered, her husband John remarried, and he remarried a lady called Margaret. We know this because we found the census records, we found wedding records, if you will, online. It's been reported and written many times that John was a broken man after the death of Sarah. You know, he lived like a reclusive life, if you will. You know, he didn't really bother with people, he wouldn't interact with people. But from what we've dug up and what we found is, he did indeed remarry 2 years later. And I think he lived on Abbey Street. I'll have to put the census records up so you guys can see it. But he lived on Abbey Street. Now, I think he was married for only 4 or 5 years, and he passed away in the early 1900s. But yeah, it was far from a broken man a year or two after the event. I mean, obviously at the time of the murder, that would have been shocking. It would have been soul destroying. He lost his wife. You know, everything that he held dear to him obviously had been taken. But yeah, from what we've dug up and what we found, he remarried, like I said, to a lady called Margaret in not 1908, sorry, but in 1898. So as you gather, we've had no luck whatsoever in finding the final resting place of Sarah Coates, and to be honest, I honestly didn't think we would today. It's such a big graveyard cemetery. There's a lot, like in other stories, like I said, there's a lot of empty, well, not empty like I said, but there's a lot of places, a lot of spaces where there's no headstones, and it's just so difficult to pinpoint exactly where Sarah will be. We do have one article which says that she was interred close to or just behind the old chapel on a new plot of land. I think that might have been the old chapel, because when you look at the old OS maps from the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, you will see a chapel here and a chapel over there. That to me looks quite new. This, however, looks the older one. So I'm thinking she was interred in this part. However, we have had a look all around. We've pretty much checked as much as we can of the actual headstones, but there's just so many, and like I said, there's a lot of spaces we just don't know who is buried below our feet. So unfortunately, as I thought would be the case, we've not found poor Sarah's final resting place. So I've got 101 questions about this story. The main one being, if, for example, John Williams Murray was indeed the chap who killed poor Sarah Coates on the 9th of June 1896, and Christopher Hindle had known this man, you know, he'd seen him before, he'd seen him locally, why didn't he name him to the police? Why didn't Christopher say it was John Williams Murray, hairdresser on Abbey Street? Some will say perhaps he didn't actually know Murray himself. You know, he might have only seen him now and again in passing. But how many times have we as individuals walked past people, you see people, but you wouldn't know who they are, you wouldn't know the names, you wouldn't know what jobs they are, where they live. But because I think Murray lived so close to Warren Street, and I think it was Chapel Street maybe, I think it was, where Hindle lived with his parents, they all lived in close proximity. So, you know, I think we could argue that could be a bit naive, but we could argue that perhaps Hindle didn't really know Murray like we think he should have known him. The other thing is, when Sarah Coates was asked who had done this deed to her, when one of the police officers asked her and she managed to say the one word, nobody, surely it would have just been as easy for her to say Christopher, if, you know, if he was the actual killer. Now obviously nobody is a bit of a grey word, isn't it? Because does nobody mean it's somebody she didn't know? We know she didn't slit her own throat and attack herself. So nobody, it's nobody I knew. It's hard to decipher that one. But if it had been Christopher, why didn't she just say Christopher? The two main questions. I mean, there's a host of other questions that we could ask with this case. Obviously another one, why didn't the police take the suicide of John Williams Murray more seriously? You know, the identification that Christopher Hindle matched up, it matched perfectly with Murray, and the morning his body was found badly mangled, you know, the blue suit, the dark tash. You know, Murray himself had also made a confession to obviously this guy who went to the press with it. You know, it was all there. I mean, we could argue and say, well, the confession, he wasn't confessing to the murder of Sarah Coates, but to a woman and her young children. That is a bit of a strange one. But this Murray said he was wanted, and the people of Accrington would be waiting for him in their hundreds for a murder. And the murder of Sarah Coates only took place the month before. There's a lot of strange similarities with Murray and the description that obviously Hindle had given the police. So it should have been, I think, taken more seriously. And like I said, Hindle himself always maintained throughout being arrested, throughout the trial, throughout being in prison, writing letters to his parents, it came across sincere in that he was saying that he was innocent of the crime. Tell me what you think down below, guys, about this one. Because like I said, it's not just about the victim herself, Sarah Coates, it is also about a 15-year-old boy. So directly in front of us is number 3 Warner Street, and this is where the events of 1896 took place. And one of these windows would have been Thomas Coates' bedroom, where the knife was taken, which obviously was used on the attack on Sarah. And as you can see, there's 2 doors, and the police seem to think that Christopher Hindle really would have used one of these along with the murderer on the escape, but no. Christopher Hindle said it was at the back of one of the back bedrooms where he jumped out at the time. But yeah, this is number 3 Warner Street. So this is back Warner Street. Now this is the street which Christopher Hindle said the perpetrator or the murderer of Sarah Coates ran down after being stopped and obviously being seen by Hindle himself. Now, Inspector Sinclair said he made a walk down this street but could not find any evidence of blood splatters. There was nothing here to suggest that Christopher Hindle's story was in fact true. Now, it's hard to actually work out which is number 3 from the back, but it could well be that building or it could well be that one. We do know that the Coates had a workshop at the back that could only be accessed from the front by going up the steps. So we're not quite sure how the murderer, if it is true, got in this way or in fact how he got out. We do know that he jumped over a fence with some iron spikes on, but again it could be here or it could be there. But yeah, this is the back of Warner Street where the perpetrator apparently made his escape when being stopped by Hindle. So, did Christopher Hindle really chase a man down these back streets? And if we believe he did, then the perpetrator took a left at the end where Vicky stood to make his way to Oak Street, which is just down there. Abbey Street is set further back in that direction. But yeah, Christopher Hindle said he run down here, he run down to his left and then down Oak Street. Interesting, what I forgot to mention is, on the time of the actual crime, there was 2 workmen working somewhere on these bikes. We don't know if it was here or it was further up there, but there were 2 workmen working that morning, and both of them said they heard no commotion, they heard no shouting, even though Hindle told them apparently that there was murder, stop that man. There were 2 guys somewhere along here, 2 workmen that morning, and they both told Inspector Hindle that nothing of the sort ever happened. And this was another thing that went against Christopher Hindle when it went to court. The workmen said nothing happened. So if you liked this story today and you like what we do, this type of content, can you please comment down below? Tell us your thoughts on this case, because like I said, it truly is a bizarre one. You know, was Sarah Coates murdered by Christopher Hindle, or was he innocent all along like he always maintained? Was it the blue man, as I call him, in the blue suit, who was the murderer? Just tell me down below, guys, what your thoughts are. But in the meantime, if you did like this story and you want more, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Don't forget, as I said, to comment down below, and also subscribe to the channel, because we've got a lot more videos coming shortly. Not all true crime related, some paranormal, some kind of urban exploration type videos, things like that, which I think you guys will like. But if you do like this, do all those things. And in the meantime, as I always say, take care, look after yourselves, and we will be back soon with another story from our dark but illustrious past. Take care, guys.